I work at a regional grocery store. I am a 26-year-old female. I graduated from college with a master's degree in psychology and still couldn't find a job. Due to family circumstances, I wasn't able to get my PhD, which was basically the bare minimum to land any decent paying job. So, I was a little stuck. I even had a hard time finding a regular job. I had applied to a bunch of lower positions, but I kept getting rejected because I was overqualified. Over and over again, people told me that I would get too bored on the job, and so they wouldn't hire me. This really sugared me off. After a certain point, my student loan payments were due and I really needed the money. I had to ask my cousin's friend for a job. He was the manager at this regional grocery store. Literally, the only position they had available was stocking shelves on night shift. I couldn't believe myself. I was so ashamed. I felt like I'd wasted years of my life and thousands of dollars in debt just to get a job anyone can do. Anyway, the job itself wasn't all that bad. I was allowed to listen to my earbuds while I worked. This meant I could turn on my favorite podcast while working. My favorite murder, if you're wondering. I must have worked there for about a year before the big change came. Previously, the store closed down at 12 in the morning. But, for whatever reason, that policy got changed and it became a 24-hour store with the exception of holidays and Sunday nights. It really sucked. What used to be my podcast and stock the shelves time kept getting interrupted by stupid customers asking where things were. That was fine. I didn't mind helping people out. I worked there after all. But they would literally ask me where the most obvious grocery items were. So many times, I couldn't help but to think, are you blind or stupid? But then there was one night when a very strange man came up to me. He had really big-ish eyes. His entire body was round. And he had the longest nose hair I've ever seen on a human being. It was like he took the hair right off his head and glued it into his nose. I was down on my knees stocking the bottom shelf with pickles when he touched my hair. I had my hair in a ponytail that night, and he lightly caressed the part of it that was touching my back. I jerked back and asked him, "What the hell?" He tried playing it off like he had arthritis, but I knew that he was just being a creep. I asked him what he wanted. He stood there for a second. He seemed to be thinking of what to say. But only one word came out of his mouth. "You." He walked up closer to me and then started to smell my shoulder. It felt so weird, and I don't think I could have been more creeped out. I told him that if he doesn't need any help finding any items, that I had work I had to be doing. But he kept standing there. He started smiling really wide, and then hugged me. "It's okay, darling. I'm going to take care of you." At this point, I was screaming inside of my own head. This freak was crossing a million different lines. I pushed him off me and ran to get my manager, who was a larger guy. He'd have no problem fighting this creep if it came to it. The creepy guy followed me as I went too. The nerve on this guy. When he saw my manager down the aisle, he must have had second thoughts because he turned around and started running away. I explained to my manager everything that had happened, and he said he'd take care of it if that guy came back again. The creep was smart, because he waited a couple of weeks before he came back. He waited long enough that the incident would not be on the tip of anyone's mind. I wasn't expecting him, and neither was my manager. I was standing there stocking a shelf like I always did, and all of a sudden I felt someone tugging my hair. They tugged really hard, and it really hurt my neck. They totally overpowered me and started dragging me across the floor. At this point, I hadn't even realized who it was until I looked up to see that man. He must have dragged me a solid 30 feet or the exit before someone saw what was going on. It wasn't my manager, but it was another one of the girls who worked with me. She was really nice and started screaming like a banshee and running at him. For one reason or another, he decided to run away again. I was really relieved. I couldn't believe that he was just going to walk up to me and start dragging me out of the store by my hair. What kind of a sicko does that? It was truly horrifying. This was finally the incident that convinced the store owner that we had to have security if we were going to be open at night. We had a security guard somewhere on the premises after that, and I felt a lot safer. I'm still looking for a job in psychology, and I really hope I can get one soon. I felt like I really needed a break after having gone through all of this. I worked at a museum a couple of years back. Maybe a decade ago now. I was a night shift security guard. It was as boring as you could imagine. But I desperately needed the money, and it paid a few dollars more than any other job I could land, so I figured why not. I remember landing a construction job a year into working this night shift security job. I enjoyed construction a lot more, and I desperately needed to get my life back on track. Being on night shift really messed with my mood and general well-being. The construction job I got had roughly the same pay, so it was a no-brainer even if I had to do a little bit more manual labor. As much as I disliked the job itself, I really liked all of the people that worked at that museum. They were actually really cool. I went ahead and gave them my 2 weeks' notice and told them that I would stick around for as long as they needed me to find a replacement. They hired some skinny pale guy named Justin. When I first met him, he seemed like he was a decent enough guy. After all, it really wasn't my problem once I left. After a couple of shifts with him though, I noticed that he was an extremely awkward and very strange person. He did this thing where he would change the tone of his voice mid-sentence. It was really strange, and it almost made me feel like he had some kind of mental issue. Trust me, I wasn't being judgmental or anything, and if you heard it yourself, you would probably have had the same concern. Not that I thought that he was dangerous or anything, just a little out there with a possible mental illness. Maybe even a speech impediment. Anyway, it was my third or fourth shift training him, and it was an ordinary night just like any other. As weird as he may have been, he seemed somewhat depressed or sad. I caught on pretty easily as he did not make much of an effort to conceal it. We were making the usual trip throughout the entire museum, which was honestly a pretty long walk. We were probably about 10 minutes into it when I finally just asked him why he seemed so sad. He told me that he was really lonely and couldn't get a girlfriend. Again, if you had one look at this guy you would understand why he couldn't get a girlfriend. Let alone his very weird personality. I tried telling him that there were plenty of fish in the sea and that he could probably have some luck on the internet. Online dating wasn't his big back. Then, he kind of shrugged his shoulders and just continued being sad. I didn't know what else I could tell him. After that point, he gradually became weirder and weirder with each passing night. It was really strange. For instance, he would start going on these massive monologues about the most random things in the world. I only had to stay for a couple more shifts, but it honestly became really intolerable being around this guy. There was one night where he talked for at least 15 entire minutes about the environmental harm of pizza crust. Yes, literally pizza crust. It made absolutely no sense in the world. I tried interrupting him a couple of times to ask what was up, but he just cut me off and even started ignoring me after a certain point. When you are completely alone in a massive building with one other person, trust me when I say that their mental well-being is very important. I gradually began feeling more and more unsafe in the presence of this weird guy. Justin seemed like he was going crazy or something. Thankfully, my last shift with him went by decently enough. It was still awkward and moderately unbearable, but it was at least over. I started my new job and everything seemed to be going really well. I had completely forgotten about Justin and life seemed to move on. I didn't really think about that security job anymore at all. That was until I heard about an interesting story from my friend a few months later. I still kept in touch with a few people from the museum that worked there during the day. We were only Facebook friends, but that was enough for me. One of them messaged me to ask me what I thought about the guy that replaced me, Justin. I was honest with her and told her that I thought Justin was a really strange guy and possibly insane or something. She typed back, "You're going to love this story then." She then proceeded to tell me about Justin being fired for completely destroying an entire exhibit on night shift. I guess they came in at the morning shift and found him trying to put it back together. They watched the security footage and this guy literally tried fighting a dinosaur skeleton. I guess he had been acting really weird that night, judging by what she told me about the rest of the security footage. But the interesting part of the story is that they somehow found out he was on antipsychotic medication. They figured that he had stopped taking his medication. That was all my friend knew. And that's all I know. It's really scary how people can just stop taking their very necessary medication on a whim and then have a complete mental breakdown. I started wondering if he had been off his meds when I met him. All I know is that I'm kind of happy I don't ever have to see Justin again. Anyone who's ever worked a night shift job will tell you that it eventually gets old. I remember being really excited about starting my first night shift job. I thought it would be so cool. Like that episode of SpongeBob with the hash-slinging slasher or something. It was nothing like that at all. In fact, it got plain old repetitive after a while. I'm a male nurse and I had been working in a hospital nearby. It was a long commute and extremely unbearable. Once I finished my contract with the hospital, which was a year, I decided to apply for another job. One that was a little less stressful and disorganized as the hospital. I got a job at a child psychiatric unit. Working with children with mental illnesses seemed like a really cool job. Maybe cool isn't even the right word, but meaningful. The hospital left me with this feeling of trying to save people who were going to die anyway. But with these kids, I could make a real difference that might turn their life around or find a way to let them cope with whatever is wrong with them. I was all around excited about it. The pay was even higher, which had me really excited too. The only problem was that the only shift available was night shift. The hiring manager told me that there might be a day shift position available within a couple of months, and I would be the first one to get it if it opened up, but that was about it. So there I was helping kids. At night. The only problem was that they were all asleep for the most part. The only time I got to do anything was when one of them woke up or started misbehaving. This very quickly became the most boring job I've ever worked in my life. About a month went by when something moderately frightening happened. It was a night like any other. I was sitting at my desk charting some stuff I'd done with the kids earlier that night. I heard a noise that I did not quite recognize at first. It sounded like some of the kids were wrestling or something. But on the bed. I got really anxious as I did not want to go in there and see the mentally handicapped kids having sex. Call me cynical, but that's where my mind went immediately. But when I got in there, I saw something that I don't think I can ever unsee. I turned the light on to see one of the older kids who was trying to smother another one. The kid that was doing the smothering had no previous incident of violent behavior. I didn't personally know these kids well enough because I didn't work during the day, but I knew their cases well enough that the kid doing the smothering had bipolar disorder. It was pretty severe, but he had never had a violent outburst like this. It was just so unusual. I immediately pulled him off the other kid, and then he started fighting me. He reached around his own head and punched me in the nose at a weird angle. This kid had to have been 11 or 12 years old, and I was honestly surprised at how much force he had behind his punch. He didn't break my nose or anything, but he definitely bloodied it up. My adrenaline kicked in after that, and I was able to restrain him without a problem. I called for a nurse from another unit in the building to come over and help me. It felt like it was forever waiting for this other nurse, but she got over within a few minutes. The entire time I was waiting though, I couldn't help but to look at this little kid who had nearly murdered another kid. When the other nurse got over, we gave him some medication that would knock him out and put him to sleep. I asked the other nurse, Carla, what I was supposed to do. She was there for a few years before me, and I assumed she would have a good answer. We just did everything you can do. Violent outbursts don't get kids thrown out of here. I was a little shocked. I argued with her a little, but that was that. I tried talking to the kid that was being smothered, and he didn't have a whole lot to say about it. He said that he didn't really know the other kid that well, but they never had a negative incident up until this night. This was a few years back now, and I cannot ever forget how I almost watched that kid die. If I had been just a few minutes later, he probably would be dead right now. It wasn't long after that experience that I started looking for another job. I got one a few weeks later and did my best to explain the situation to my case manager. She didn't seem to understand or care, but that's not my problem anymore.